Hey, it's Kelly with your A1 Extra. Y'all know I love checking in with the weather homie Sean Sublette to get the forecast and hear what's going on in crazy RVA weather. And right now, it's pollen. Well, Sean wrote a piece for the RTD recently where he went deeper on pollen, even talking with doctors and professors about the pollen in our Richmond environment. Here's Sean for this week's A1 Extra.
There's this idea, is the pollen getting worse? Is the pollen getting worse as we get into the springtime here in Central Virginia? And we go back with some help from our friends at Climate Central and the Science Museum of Virginia, and certainly that is what we found. It's going back to the late 80s. We've seen the amount of pollen on the increase. The time that it expands or the time that it peaks is a little bit earlier in the year. So the pollen's getting stronger, it's showing up earlier. We talked to Allergy Partners of Richmond. Becky Colley is the person who's been taking the pollen readings almost daily since the late 1980s, tracking the pollen so strongly over these past several decades. We also talked to Dr. Jeremy Hoffman at the Science Museum of Virginia for a little more perspective. They were able to give us the data. We want to go back and verify, well, this is the way it seems. Does the data pan out? Does it match what our expectations are? And that is exactly what we found out. Looking at a warming planet, looking at the idea that with winters not as strong, the graphic behind you shows the number of growing degree days, but it shows the total number of hours above the 50-degree mark during the course of the year. So what this ultimately tells us is that the winters are not as cold anymore. So the trees don't go into dormancy as long as they did just 30 or 40 years ago. So the pollen shows up earlier. The allergens themselves are getting stronger. So we're seeing more frequent visits to urgent care, more frequent visits to emergency rooms, not just for allergy attacks, but allergy-induced asthma, because that's another folding in or cascading aspect to the increased amount of pollen in the atmosphere. It is more of an irritant, so it can trigger other diseases.
That's it for this week's A1 Extra. Make sure you visit richmond.com/subscribe for more reporting and stories of Richmond and Central Virginia. And remember to follow along on Instagram and Twitter at RTD News. We'll see you next week for another A1 Extra.